Welcome to 2024. I hope everyone enjoyed their break. I know it was a fairly difficult one for a lot of people because of the weather, but hopefully people got some downtime. We just wanted to start the year with a quick overview of the investment landscape. 2023 was actually a pretty interesting year. It probably performed far better than we actually expected it to. So I want to touch a little bit on why that happened, especially that last quarter, but also how that leaves us for 2024 and whether or not we can be as positive for 2024. And I think there's some pretty good fundamentals we need to think about. So we talk about 23. 23 was quite a volatile year. We had a lot of ups and downs. And even as far as sort of August, September, we actually saw a semi-correction. But I'd have to say we finished really well. And the reason we finished well was actually the fundamentals around inflation. So I don't want to go too much history, but track yourself back through COVID, you saw a really dramatic increase in inflation, and probably most of them peaked right at the end of 2022, where you saw, I think, Australian inflation rates were over 8%, the US was over 9%. Those sort of numbers were all flowing into the cost of everything, and the question mark was that inflation rate still built into it, or was that inflation rate caused by COVID? Fundamentally, the argument would be, say, supply chains were one of the biggest drivers on that, and we're now seeing the easing of that. So roll forward to the end of 2023, inflation numbers are then coming well back. So he's talking about inflation numbers of in the 3s to 4s, and look, they're numbers that reserve banks and federal reserves can be comfortable with. Yes, they probably want to see them under 3, but you've still got some big drivers like shelter, and shelter is rental properties and housing properties. So we've all seen what happened to housing prices. So those ones are still in there. So they're still driving inflation. Fuel has started to soften, and I think we've all noticed that at the Bowser. Unfortunately, Australia, we've still got quite a few concerns around normal energy costs like electricity and gas. They're being subsidised, but subsidy is only a subsidy. It means there's still the fundamental cost is still the same, so that's still sitting out there. So anyway, markets like the fact inflation was softening. That means that inflation as a building block for interest rates would actually see interest rates start to soften and ease as well. I'm not a big proponent of that. I think 2024, a lot of people are talking about interest rate cuts and other bits and pieces. And honestly, it's a mug's game trying to forecast interest rates. But what you can say is we've probably got fairly solid inflation. We've got very low unemployment, still around 3.8% in Australia and only 3.8% in the US as well. To give you some perspective, the long-term average is about 5.4. So 3.8 means a lot of people are working. So it means the economy is pretty solid. And so I don't think you're necessarily going to see interest rates start to decline based on that. So best case, I think we're going sideways with a slight easing bias. And that's good, because that then means we can start looking at fundamental price growth based on consumer spending and product sales. So that's a good place to be. So I suppose painted 24, we're starting in a position where fundamentals count. So if you're looking at, when we look at investments, we always look at what's driving the investment, and fundamentally what drives investment is earnings growth. Earnings growth is now can be focused on consumer spending. We're not as scared of recession, so therefore consumers will continue to spend. Unemployment rates are low, so they're not scared of where their next paycheck's coming from. So all of those things lead into good quality stocks, cashed up with little debt, are actually going to perform reasonably well in this market. So I think 2024 actually starts well. I think by the end of 2024, we're probably going to see some of those inflationary impacts. We already know Germany, which is probably the engine room for Europe, has its, if we looked at 2023, they actually had a negative GDP growth year of 0.3%. It's not huge, but if they're the biggest driver for Europe, you can say there's a very large chunk of the world's economies which are softening, and probably we're then going to see that softening roll around the world a little bit. China's not going to be the growth engine it has been in the past, so we can't rely on that. But I think fundamentally, if we can just focus on good quality companies, good cash flow companies, low debt to equity ratios, so not being impacted hugely by interest rate moves, then there's some really good potential for investment growth through 2024.